On December 16, 1944, before dawn in the Ardennes, around 80,000 American soldiers were holding what they believed was a secondary stretch of forest near the front, a place used to rest worn-out units rather than to meet a major assault. The offensive that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge was about to break over them. On the other side of the line, more than 200,000 German troops and roughly 1,600 artillery pieces were positioned in the dark along an 80-mile front, engines ticking in the cold. Far to the south, in the city of Nancy, maps in 3rd Army headquarters already showed grease pencil arrows turning north, drawn for General George S. Patton. For weeks, a Wisconsin-born intelligence officer there, Colonel Oscar W. Koch, had been warning Patton that this sector was a trap, and that a large German attack would come through it. Within hours, the last great German offensive in the West would begin, and one of the few Allied armies able to move at once was Patton's, because he had taken Koch's warning seriously. By late autumn 1944, the Western Allies seemed to many observers to be on the brink of victory. Paris had been liberated in August, and American and British armies had pushed the Wehrmacht back through France to the German frontier. Newspapers in the United States were already predicting that some soldiers might be home by Christmas. At General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters, the focus had shifted to the next step, breaking through the German defensive belt and forcing a crossing of the Rhine, the last major barrier before the heartland of the Reich. For George S. Patton, commanding 3rd Army from Nancy in France, that broad plan matched what his own army was preparing to do. His troops had just fought hard battles around Metz and were getting ready for a new eastward offensive, scheduled for December 19, 1944, toward the Saar and eventually the Rhine. People who worked with Patton often described him as loud, impatient, and aggressive, famous for his pearl-handled pistols and for his constant emphasis that momentum wins wars. Lower down the line, though, the situation did not look uniformly reassuring. In northern Luxembourg and eastern Belgium lay the Ardennes, a region of steep ridges, thick woods and poor roads. It had been quiet for months. Tired American divisions rotated into the sector to recover, and many positions were held by inexperienced or refitting units. On paper, to many Allied planners, it looked like the safest place on the Western Front. That quiet reputation was exactly what drew the attention of 3rd Army's G2, Colonel Oscar Koch. Koch had followed Patton since the North African campaign, serving as his intelligence chief in I Armored Corps, 7th Army, and then 3rd Army. Patton trusted him more than many commanders trusted their G2s, in part because Koch had already been judged correct several times about German strength and intentions, in Sicily and in France. In the early winter of 1944, Koch and his section began to see a pattern that did not fit the general optimism. Radio traffic from German units opposite the Ardennes shifted. Some networks went unusually quiet. Others moved to different frequencies. At night, there was more vehicle movement on the German side. When the weather allowed, aerial reconnaissance showed formations, leaving obvious sectors, and concentrating in forested areas. Prisoners of war reported that new armored units were arriving and that fuel and ammunition depots were being built up well behind the line. Taken one by one, each report could be explained in routine terms. Relief of worn-out units, reshuffling of reserves, preparations for local counterattacks. That was how many staff officers read them. German fuel shortages were well known, and many senior Allied officers believed that a large-scale offensive was beyond German capacity. Koch looked at the same fragments in a different way. He compared traffic analysis, map studies of roads and rivers, and the known locations of German armored reserves. As he and his team laid the information over their maps, one picture kept coming back. He concluded that the Germans were preparing a major offensive not directly against 3rd Army, but against 1st Army's sector to the north, pushing through the supposedly quiet Ardennes toward the Meuse River and the vital port of Antwerp. If such a blow landed and succeeded, it would drive a wedge between the British and American armies and leave Patton's own flank exposed. By early December, Koch judged that the threat was serious enough that it should influence operations rather than sit in a routine report. On December 9, 1944, he briefed Patton in detail, arguing that German strength, the terrain, the likely timing, and the poor flying weather all pointed toward an imminent large-scale attack in the Ardennes. Many Allied intelligence officers had noticed signs of German concentration, Most still expected those forces to be used defensively or in limited spoiling attacks. Later accounts credit Koch as one of the few who argued that a major and risky offensive through the Ardennes itself was not only possible but likely. For Patton, Koch's assessment created a real dilemma. Third Army was set for its own offensive, and diverting attention and resources to a threat on another army's front went against the drive to keep pushing east that colleagues often associated with him and with pressure from higher headquarters. Patton also had his own background in intelligence work. Earlier in his career, he had served as a G2, and he liked to say in his own writings and comments that good information had to be used aggressively. He knew Koch's record and did not dismiss it. So instead of setting the warning aside, he chose to act on it. In the days after Koch's December briefing, he told his staff to do more than file the assessment. They began to outline options for what Third Army might do if a German attack broke through First Army's sector in the Ardennes and threatened his northern flank. When the German offensive did in fact begin and reports of serious penetration started to arrive, those rough ideas were turned into 3 detailed contingency plans. Staff officers in Nancy worked out 3 possible operations that all started from the same assumption. A German breakthrough in the Ardennes that created a gap in First Army and exposed Third Army on its open side. Each plan required Third Army to halt its eastward drive, turn roughly 90 degrees, and attack north through winter roads across Luxembourg toward whatever crisis point higher headquarters identified. One of the planned thrusts aimed toward the area of Bastogne, the road hub in the center of the Ardennes road network. On the maps, the arrows were clear and simple. On the ground, officers understood that if these plans were ever used, the movement would be a major logistical strain. Even so, the routes had been studied and the staff had rehearsed the movement on paper. Most Allied headquarters did not go that far. Intelligence summaries at Schaff and at First Army noted that German forces were building up, but the prevailing view still held that Germany could not afford a major offensive in the West. Koch and Patton were quietly preparing for the opposite. At about 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the German offensive, codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein, began. Across an 80-mile front, the Wehrmacht opened fire with roughly 1,600 artillery pieces, followed by waves of infantry and armored units moving out of the forests under heavy snow and fog. On the American side, under strength divisions, many of them new to large-scale combat, were hit before their commanders could fully understand what was happening. Communications lines failed, some headquarters were overrun, and units fell back into scattered pockets of resistance. The German plan was straightforward and ambitious. The aim was to punch through the thin American line, cross the Meuse, seize key bridges, and drive on Antwerp. If that port could be taken out of Allied use, the German leadership hoped that the Western Allies might be forced into negotiations. In the opening phase, about 80,000 Americans in the Ardennes faced an assault force of more than 200,000 German troops, with around 1,900 guns and about 1,000 tanks and assault guns behind them. At higher headquarters, the first hours produced real confusion. Allied intelligence had not been blind, the build-up in German units had been seen, but many analysts had misread its purpose. A number of staff officers initially assumed this was a local counterattack. Reports coming in from forward units quickly showed that it was much larger than that. In Nancy, those early messages reached an army headquarters that had already been thinking about the possibility of a major Ardennes attack. Koch began plotting the reported breakthroughs on the overlays he already had on his maps. The pattern matched the offensive he had warned about. Patton now had to turn the contingency plans into orders. On December 19, 1944, senior Allied commanders met at Verdun. Eisenhower and his staff had to decide how to respond to the rapidly growing German bulge in the line. American forces around the town of Bastogne, a key road junction, were under heavy pressure and risked encirclement. The officers in the room understood that if the Germans broke through to the Meuse and beyond, the Western Front could split apart. When they discussed who could counterattack into the southern flank of the German advance, most commanders spoke in terms of needing several days or even weeks. Moving large formations in winter over crowded roads while they were already engaged in offensive operations looked slow and difficult on paper. Patton's answer cut across that expectation. Because his staff had already drawn up and refined 3 contingency plans for a turn north, he knew what he could offer. When called on, he said that he could attack north with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Accounts from that meeting describe the room as surprised and some officers as openly skeptical. Even so, the orders went out. Third Army's planned drive east was cancelled and the turn north was approved. After that decision, the main task was actually moving the army. Third Army now had to swing a very large force through winter conditions. Corps and divisions, in contact with the enemy, had to disengage, reroute, and drive toward Luxembourg and Belgium, while still keeping supply lines running and trying to avoid complete traffic jams. Within days, 6 divisions were on the move north through snow, ice, and crowded roads. In total, roughly 250,000 men, about 133,000 vehicles, and some 62,000 tons of supplies were redirected to strike into the German flank and ease the pressure in the Ardennes. For the soldiers on the ground, this meant nights in frozen vehicles, convoys that barely moved, military police trying to clear intersections, blocked with tanks, trucks, artillery and ambulances, all of it in bitter weather, with the Luftwaffe occasionally attacking the roads and columns when the clouds opened enough for aircraft to fly. The Germans were fighting the same weather and terrain. Their timetable depended heavily on capturing fuel from Allied depots. Allied resistance at key points such as Elsenborn Ridge and around Bastogne slowed them, forced detours and used up time and gasoline. As Third Army's leading elements drove north, Bastogne became the main focus. Road networks in the Ardennes ran through the town, and whoever held it had a major influence over movement across the central part of the battlefield. By December 20th, 1944, German forces had encircled Bastogne, trapping elements of the 101st Airborne Division and other units in the town. Snow, fog, artillery fire, and repeated German attacks turned Bastogne into a hard-pressed pocket of resistance. Third Army's task was to break the encirclement. Patton's spearhead toward Bastogne was led by 4th Armored Division. Its columns fought through snow-covered villages and narrow roads and pushed against German units that were themselves stretched and short of fuel. On December 26, 1944, tanks from 4th Armored made contact with the defenders of Bastogne, opening a corridor into the town and easing the siege. The encirclement was broken, although heavy fighting in the surrounding area continued. The German offensive never reached the Meuse. Its armored spearheads fell short of their main objectives and were worn down by resistance on the shoulders of the Bulge and by the return of strong Allied air power once the weather improved. By late January 1945, Allied forces had pushed the line back to roughly its earlier position. The losses were heavy. American forces in the Ardennes campaign suffered around 89,000 casualties, including roughly 19,000 killed in action. By those measures, the Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States Army in the Second World War. Koch's work was not the only reason the offensive failed. Frontline units that held under intense pressure, decisions by many Allied commanders, the renewed strength of Allied air forces, and German shortages all played important roles. Third Army's ability to pivot and attack quickly into the Bulge was one of the central factors in closing what historians often describe as Hitler's last major chance in the West, and that pivot had begun with an intelligence assessment that did not match the prevailing view. After the war, Oskar Koch stayed in uniform, even though his name never became as well known as the generals he supported. He organized and commanded the Army Ground Forces Intelligence School at Fort Riley, helping shape peacetime doctrine for the kind of combat intelligence he had practiced under Patton. He later served as Director of Intelligence in occupied Austria and worked with the early Central Intelligence Agency on training programs. Promoted to Brigadier General in 1954, he went on to serve as Assistant Division Commander and briefly acting commander of the 25th Infantry Division in Korea before retiring later that year. In retirement, he settled in Illinois, wrote about intelligence in war, and remained active in civic life. He died in 1970 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His career was not marked by monuments or films, but his influence continued in manuals, classrooms, and in the way later generations of intelligence officers were taught to think about patterns, warning, and the risk of being the one dissenting voice. Patton's northward turn during the Battle of the Bulge has often been described by historians as one of the most notable operational maneuvers of the war. That view rests partly on the speed of the movement. partly on the way it was carried out, and partly on the fact that when the blow fell in the Ardennes, Third Army was not improvising from nothing. Koch's December analysis did not secure victory on its own. Later accounts argue that it bought time by forcing one major American army to think seriously about a scenario many others still treated as unlikely, and by putting maps, routes, and timetables in place before the German attack began. The Ardennes offensive has often been cited as a case where institutions underestimated what an enemy might attempt because it seemed irrational or logistically too difficult, and as a case where one commander took a quiet warning seriously enough to turn it into specific plans. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was decided by hundreds of thousands of people. Riflemen in foxholes, gunners on frozen gun lines, tank crews on icy roads, and staff officers wrestling with traffic and fuel problems. Among them was a reserved intelligence officer in a stone building in Nancy, working through reports that did not fit the story many people preferred to believe. His name was Oscar W. Koch. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing, and click the video on the screen to watch another.